This happened in May of 2015 in California, which will help those of you who are familiar. I had graduated college in June of 2014, moved back to my old hometown and started a consulting company with my boyfriend, which was going very well. We had just finished a contract in the Bay Area and were beginning a new one about 8 hours south in Torrance. He moved down there first to start setting up, while I took care of loose ends at our closing contract before moving down to meet him. The day comes and I pack my car and head south down the I-5. For the uninitiated, it's a straight highway with little in the way of scenery aside from the occasional strip mall, and its monotony has a reputation for putting drivers to sleep at the wheel. I pass a strip mall with gas and a fast food joint and decide to fill my car and my stomach. I go to park in the food venue's parking lot, but it's completely full, so I park across the street at a hotel, which at the time I didn't think anything of. I go inside and eat my meal, then cross the street to get back to my car. I'm well into the hotel parking lot when a pickup truck pulls down the aisle and cuts off my path and stops, with the passenger's side facing me. The driver is alone, and a clean-cut white male in his mid-30s. I don't remember anything about him except that he looked very generic and buttoned up. The way he pulled in front of me to block my path didn't initially set off alarm bells, as he had done it pretty organically. He rolls down the window, and the dialogue follows. "Excuse me, miss, but could you tell me where the grocery store in town is?" "I'm sorry, I'm not from here, so I couldn't say." "Oh, where are you from?" Good question. I don't know, not here though." I didn't say that to be rude. I had just moved through so many cities at that point and was on my way to a new one. I wasn't sure how to answer. He laughs and makes a joke, and then asks me where I'm headed. I mentioned that I'm moving. I will say, he was very charismatic, and at this point, I just think he was trying to flirt with me, and if I hadn't been so exhausted or in a relationship, on another day, it might have worked. He makes another comment about how unpleasant moving can be. Absolutely true. And then gives a warm chuckle and extends his hand to shake mine and goes, "Well, I'm glad I got to meet you. I'm Scott." If you recall, the truck is in front of me with the passenger's side facing me. I actually take a step forward to grab his hand and then got the delayed response of every alarm bell that should have gone off earlier. I'm in a hotel parking lot. He asks me a question that establishes I don't know where I am, another question that establishes I'm alone, another question that establishes I'm not expected at my destination for many more hours. The thing that connected all these synapses? When he extended his hand, he didn't even make the faintest effort to make it accessible to me. He didn't lean over the seat or move toward me in any way. His hand was hovering comfortably over the center console waiting for me to grasp it, which in order to do, I would have to lean well into the car. Again, I had already taken a step toward him and begun to raise my hand to take his when the sirens went off. I rocked backwards back to where I was standing, and I just remember looking in his eyes for what felt like forever, feeling everything click into place while also half convinced my imagination was just running wild. His hand still waiting, I lowered mine and felt my eyes slightly narrow with suspicion, and slowly said, "I'm going to walk away from your car now, Scott." Boom. Truck burns rubber with thick gray smoke as the guy guns it out of the hotel lot at 100 miles per hour. He must have been flooring it. Regrettably smart on his end because I didn't have the license plate number or anything to offer the police. In the immediate minutes following the event, I felt relieved but hadn't really processed the full weight of what happened. Unfortunately for me, I had many more hours to think back and analyze the whole interaction to shreds. The car was somewhat lifted. There could have easily been another person or even 2 to 3 other people hiding inside. Would he have pulled me in? Would I have been injected with something? Then my mind just kept creating all these scenarios where I wake up hours later and nobody would even know where in my drive I went missing or possibly not notice for most of the day. I still get creeped out thinking about how close I came to taking his hand, and how fortunate I was that I didn't allow my reaction to be driven by my manners, as criminals often take advantage of. I had just moved into a new flat with some friends for university. At this point, we didn't know the area well and were still getting our feet on the ground. We had a large chain supermarket a few blocks from us, and none of us had a car, so that's normally where we'd go for shopping because it was in walking distance. The supermarket had a foyer with some benches, so normally whoever finished shopping first would wait for the others there. On this day, my flatmate Kate finished shopping before the rest of us, so she went to wait out front. It was late evening and the store was winding up, so she basically was alone in the foyer. She buried herself in her phone when a man sat down next to her on the bench, much closer than was comfortable. Now, we live in a small city in a small country where there isn't a lot of racial diversity, so it's worth mentioning this guy was black. She later told me it was the first time she'd ever even met a person of African descent. There really just aren't many of them in our country, let alone in our city. He was wearing a completely black suit that didn't fit him, and he smelled overpoweringly of cologne and cigarettes. Kate told me he smelled like he hadn't washed in a while, too. According to her, there was a fairly long pause after he sat down, and the conversation went something like this. "Hello? Hi? You have beautiful hair." "Thanks. What is your name?" Louise. Yours?" "I'm from Somalia." Brief pause. "Where do you live?" It was at this point I had finished and came out to meet her. I could immediately tell how tense and uncomfortable she was. As soon as she saw me, she jumped up. I can still remember his face. While he was talking to her, he had this kind of creepy fixed grin, all teeth and roaming eyes that were all over her. As soon as he saw me, the smile was gone, replaced by a completely blank expression. He got off the bench almost before she did and turned and walked toward the store entrance, as if he was trying to pretend I couldn't see him that way. On the way home, she told me how creeped out she was, and how she'd probably take her motor scooter to a different store in the future. I thought she was overreacting, but she should do whatever makes her feel safest, I thought. She was only 18 and pretty sheltered. This kind of thing had never happened to her before. A few hours after we get home, I'm just about to go to bed. While I'm brushing my teeth, I hear someone knock at the door. We hadn't been living there long, and we'd literally never had someone come to the door like that, let alone near midnight. I was immediately on edge. As I opened the door just a crack, I put my full weight against the frame to stop it getting forced open. There on the doorstep was the guy from the supermarket. He had his creepy fixed smile on again. "Can Louise come out?" At first I couldn't really understand his accent, but I worked him out after a few seconds. "Nobody with that name lives here." I didn't know Kate had been smart enough to give him a false name, but it didn't matter. When I said that, he dropped the smile but didn't walk away. Instead, "Can I have your phone?" "No." "Can I borrow your cigarettes?" "No. Goodbye." At this point I closed the door. I watched through our kitchen window as he wandered slowly down our driveway and onto the dark street. He didn't look back, but instead he pulled out his own cell phone and started making a call. He must have followed us home. There was no other way he could have known where we live. The fact that he knew that I smoked at that time meant he'd watched me come out of the house at some point during the evening. I hadn't had a smoke on the walk home, and I'd cooked dinner as soon as I got back. I only went out for a smoke after I'd eaten, which was probably an hour and a half after we got back. Had he been out there somewhere in the bushes, watching that whole time? And if he had his own phone, why did he need mine? I told Kate and made sure to keep all doors and windows locked. I was shaken up, and I didn't sleep much at all that night. But by the next day, I'd calmed down and put it out of my mind. A few days later in the early afternoon, while I was biking to work, I saw him walking near our house. He was wearing the exact same clothes as before, on the phone and smoking a cigarette. Almost as soon as I got to work, I got a call from one of my flatmates. The guy had knocked on the door again, once again asking for Louise. I told him the story quickly before I clocked in for my shift, and he promised to keep an eye on things during the evening. That was the last I heard of our odd visitor for months. Eventually I learned our neighbors over the road were refugees from Somalia, and one afternoon I introduced myself to them and started chatting about neighborly stuff. They were a house of 4 middle-aged single mothers, all with young kids and absent fathers who had either been killed in conflict or had been denied refugee status. To put it lightly, Somalia really didn't sound like a great place to live. It turns out my town has a very small but close-knit community of Somalians, only about 150 people, almost all of them refugees. I was unaware, but I found out that their culture values sharing as a community value. If you need something, you can ask for it, and your neighbor will usually give it to you. Something like sharing a cell phone around the community is pretty normal. Obviously, that doesn't apply here, but that's where he had come from. The more I talked and learned, the more it kind of made sense why this guy was acting the way he did. He was a fish out of water, didn't understand his behavior was a bit creepy in his new home country, and was just trying to be friendly. I honestly started to feel really bad about judging him so harshly, even if he did make my friend uncomfortable. One of the times I was talking to the neighbor ladies, I asked if they knew who he was. At first they were confused and weren't sure who I was talking about, but as I started describing him, they went away from my friendly, laughing neighbors to deadly serious. They started asking questions about him. When was he here? What did he want? Who was he on the phone with? Suddenly I was the one getting grilled. Eventually they started explaining what they knew. They knew of him, but didn't know him personally. According to them, they thought he had been involved in human trafficking back in Somalia. In fact, the exact word they used was slavery. They didn't explain much, and I understood from what they said that the trafficking generally involves young, beautiful girls, a lot like my flatmate Kate. They wouldn't tell me his name, and they didn't know what he did for a living now that he was here. They told me since he had been in our country, he'd been in constant trouble with the police for following young women, even though he was apparently married to someone back in Somalia. They found that to be the most dishonorable thing about him, even though he had been arrested a few times for theft. They didn't really like him because they felt that people like him gave their community a bad name. A year or two went by after this, and by total chance I saw a short article in the newspaper. The headline was something like, "Refugee Convicted of Sexual Assault." His name was suppressed, but the article revealed he was Somalian. A couple of months after I'd last seen him, he'd forced his way into another student flat by following some girls home from class. He waited a few hours until only one of them was home, then barged through the door when she answered it, and assaulted her. He'd stolen her cell phone and laptop afterwards. That kind of thing almost never happens in our city, and the similarities between what happened there and what happened to us made me certain it was the same guy. I never found out what happened to him after that, but I hope he's still in prison. I really don't think less of the local Somalian community because of him, though. The ladies I was friends with were some of the nicest and friendliest people I'd ever met. The hardships they've gone through aren't something anyone should have to experience, and for them to come out smiling and positive takes a strength I don't think I could ever possess. Just to give a little background, there was a boy I met in high school with a reputation for being creepy that I didn't take seriously enough when we first met. I could talk for days about the hell he put me through over the past 9 years, but I only wanted to recount the story of our most recent encounter. This happened a few months ago while I was still living in an apartment in the town my college is in. I have since moved back to my hometown to live with my parents while I finish up school, since I finally have a car and the commute is usually less than 30 minutes, plus housing in the town where my college is so expensive. Final bit of background. Although I know that this guy has a weird obsession with me, it had been nearly a year to this day since he had last tried to contact me, and more than that since I had run into him in person, so he wasn't exactly at the front of my mind. In high school, my friends and I were always very careful with my home address, and I am thankful he doesn't know where I live now. Over the summer, I joined a slow-pitch co-ed rec softball team. I hadn't played since high school, and being back on the field was such a joy. I'd invited a few of my coworkers to the game since we were fairly a tight-knit group. They were our only spectators that night, from the bleachers as far as I could tell. I slipped my phone into my bat bag so I could focus on the game. Afterwards, when I had gotten back into my car and was queuing up some music, I noticed a text from a number I didn't recognize, saying I hit well in the game that night. I thought it was from my coworker's girlfriend who had recently started working with us as well, and decided I would thank her when I got home. It's important for me to note the setup of my apartment building. We have a tenants-only lot that is nearer to the back door of the building, which is locked at all hours of the day, and is the entrance that I usually use because it led in right by the stairs. I lived at the first apartment to the right from the stairs on the second floor. The front entrance, however, had an outer door that has always been unlocked and an inner door that was always locked. Next to the inner door was the buzzer, and our landlord listed the tenants' last names next to the buttons. This entryway and inner door is all glass, and you can look down into the entryway from the second floor. There were no security cameras at either entrance. I didn't feel like I was being followed on my drive home, and I am usually very cautious and paranoid, even thinking I am being followed when I am not. This night I was exhausted after a day full of work and a 9 p.m. softball game. I parked and entered my apartment as usual, locking the door behind me. I had barely been home for 10 minutes when the buzzer started making noise. My roommates weren't home and I wasn't expecting any guests. The buzzer is such a loud and unpleasant noise, and it used to put me on edge every time I would hear it. My roommate would often leave her keys at home and ring me to let her in, but she would always text first, and I had not heard from her. I decided to check the entryway to see if it was one of my roommates rather than hitting the button to let this mystery guest in, and I am so glad that I did. When I got down the hall, I thought I would faint. I would recognize this idiot anywhere. He saw me through the windows and began screaming at me to let him in. I bolted back to my apartment and locked the deadbolt and chain, plus our patio door for good measure because, although I lived on the second floor, it would not be difficult for someone of his height to climb up. I called the police, and they were there within a few minutes, but he had already disappeared by that time. The cops took my statement, and I showed them the message, because by that time I had deduced that it wasn't from my coworker. I blocked the number. They left someone stationed at my building that night in case he showed back up, but never did. I was too terrified to sleep, and the guy I was kind of seeing told me I had overreacted, and he wouldn't come keep me company, nor would he let me stay over that night. I hadn't heard from him since, but that doesn't mean that I won't. I know. It's been 9 years. He always finds me. I will be leaving the state when I graduate for a lot of reasons, but he is one of them. When I am bored, I sometimes hop onto Tinder to meet new and interesting people. I rarely attempt to meet these people in person, and when I do, it is normally just to meet up. Well, this is one of those nights I met a really nice-sounding woman who said she loved caffeine and video games. We were talking for a while that night, and when I was ready to jump off and go to bed, she asked if I wanted her number. I didn't want her to have my number, so I said, "No, that's okay. I know where to find you." And I meant on Tinder. Flash forward to the next day, when the new Assassin's Creed Origins game came out. I had pre-ordered the games months before and walked into literally the closest GameStop to my house, and guess who I see behind the counter? She had a sheer look of horror on her face, but I hadn't quite figured out it was her yet. There wasn't much of a line, and I got up to the register, and she yells loud enough so everyone in the store could hear, "This is what you meant?" And she stormed off to the back room, and a couple of minutes later, another employee came out and asked me to leave. One thing I should point out is that in person, this girl looked nothing like her profile picture, so I still didn't know what was going on. I explained to this new employee that I was here to pick up my pre-order, and that I didn't understand why I needed to leave. They then threatened to call the cops if I didn't leave. I just gave up and left. Later, I got a message on Tinder asking how I knew where she worked. I didn't respond to this message, and instead I called the GameStop and explained to them that I didn't want to upset Kathy any more than I had already, and asked if they could move my pre-order to another store. The manager apologized to me and was able to move my pre-order. Even though this is the closest GameStop to my house, I haven't returned, and it will probably be a while before I do. This occurred some years ago in 2012 when I was 18. I was interrailing through Europe with my then boyfriend, and we were on a train between Rome and a port town in Italy, where we would be getting on a boat to Greece the following day. We hadn't pre-booked any accommodation, as we found it really easy to get a hostel either en route or on arrival at our previous destination, and as we'd been arriving in the town at nearly midnight, we decided to have a look for hostels whilst on the train. Unfortunately, we found there really wasn't as much accommodation where we were heading as there had been in other major cities we had visited, and that the places we could find were mainly hotels and way out of our price range. We were discussing this quandary amongst ourselves, my ex suggesting we slept at the station, when the guy sitting next to me on the train randomly struck up a conversation. He was really enthusiastic and chatty and spoke pretty good English, asking about our trip so far, where we were from, and just a sort of general chit-chat about ourselves. He also said that he had overheard our accommodation problem and that he knew a perfect hostel for us, very close to the station and run by a friend of his. Initially, this just came across as a useful bit of information, but alarm bells started ringing for me as he became very insistent that we must stay there, and that if we mentioned his name that he had sent us, that we could stay there virtually for free. He wrote down an address and his name on a piece of paper and had me promise that we would go there. After I'd given my word to stay there, he stopped talking to me entirely, which I found quite odd. He'd been so warm and talkative and then just totally shut off. He also made 3 phone calls, none of which I could understand other than they said the word Interrail a few times. The rest of the journey passed in slightly uncomfortable silence, and when I got up to get off of the train, he just said, "Remember." We arrived in the town and it was late and pretty deserted, nothing like the big touristy cities we had been used to, and I made up my mind then and there that we definitely wouldn't be staying in the hostel. My boyfriend was slightly annoyed as I, admittedly, am a very paranoid person, but something just felt really off to me. We ended up checking into an annoyingly expensive hotel, literally a stone's throw from the station, as I was so creeped out I didn't want to go wandering off through the empty streets at night. Whilst at the hotel, I decided to look up the address he gave us. First thing to say is that if you Googled it, there was no mention at all of it being a hostel or a guest house or anything. It just came up as a street address, and secondly, if you put it in on Google Maps, it wasn't anywhere near the station and just looked like a normal building in a residential area way out of the city center. I know that there may have been a perfectly innocent explanation behind it, and it may have just been that the guy ran a hostel from his house and train guy was just overly eager to promote business for his mate, but the whole encounter felt very off to me, and I was relieved to leave the town the following day. I can't help but wonder, to this day, whether or not we were being sent into some sort of trap. It was late at night one day and me and my mom hadn't eaten any dinner, and we hadn't been grocery shopping, so we decided to go order from a local Chinese shop. So me and my mother placed our orders and went to the Chinese shop. When we got there, there were 2 guys standing in front of the shop. This wasn't too unusual since homeless people hung out there all the time, mooching money. When we first went in, I saw no one in the store, so we went in and looked around, and then suddenly one of the workers there popped up behind the counter. She looked shocked and confused at first. We told her our order and then we left. I looked at my mom, who had a pale look on her face. When I started to head to our car, I noticed one of the guys approach me. I guess coming from a violent city, I guess fight or flight kicked in. I'm still shocked at how I responded, but I practically jumped in my car. I guess my pursuer gave up, which was one of the 2 men. However, the other men decided to approach my mom's side, which was the driver's side. My mother instantly put it into gear and drove away, and he was right by the window. No big deal, right? I might be jumping to conclusions, so me and my mom decided to go uptown to the town's soda machine. When we got there, my mom began to get sodas. After a while, I noticed a figure approaching. It was in a big part of the neighborhood, and it was late, so I wanted her to hurry. I then noticed as the dark figure got closer, it was the same man who approached my mother's side of the window. She got back to the car before the figure approached. The soda machine wasn't far from the Chinese place, but still a bit of a distance, so I think the guy followed us there. When we drove off, the guy took the hood of his coat and pulled it down to hide his face, and when we passed him in a car, he began to run away. While we were driving, I asked if the worker at the Chinese place was hiding from the 2 guys, and she gave me this sideways glance and said, "No, she was loading a pistol." And we drove in silence on the way home. When I was in 5th grade, my parents and I always went to Whole Foods on Saturdays to get salads and soups. I live in a very nice part of Illinois, the North Shore, with few serious crimes, little to no homeless people or creeps in general, and I was too young to be catcalled. We walked into the store, went to the usual salad bar, and my parents started making their salads. I was alone and had noticed a very tall man wearing a trench coat smiling at me. Thinking nothing of it, I waved to him and started making my salad. He started to circle the salad bar, each circle getting closer and closer to me. However, my back was turned to him and I didn't notice. Before I knew it, he was literally standing right behind me, opening his trench coat, basically trying to shove me in it. My dad noticed this and started yelling uncontrollably, "Hey, what are you doing? Get away from my daughter!" That's all I remember him saying before the man was roughly escorted out of the store. We were told by the manager that this man had been circling the salad bar for 4 hours, but since he technically wasn't doing anything wrong, they couldn't take any precautions. Well, until he tried to kidnap me. I was so scared for months after that. I'm 21 years old and still have not stepped foot in a Whole Foods. In my city, the downtown area is pretty spread out. At the time, I was living in an apartment just outside of the eastern edge of downtown. Walking was my primary method of transportation at the time, as parking is scarce and rarely free. On this particular occasion, I went to a job interview about a half-hour's walk from my place just outside the northern edge of downtown. It went really well, actually, but I ended up not taking the job due to the following events. I left the business in a very good mood and a skip to my step. It was in the middle of the day, and the sun was bright, and the streets were busy with passing cars. I felt pretty safe to walk back home rather than take the bus, and the easiest way for me to do so would be to walk south along the street I was walking on until it crossed my street, then turn and head east. A few days prior, I had forgotten my iPod at the mall, and it was gone. So along the route, when I heard someone say, "You got a really nice booty," from right behind me, I heard it perfectly. I decided to keep walking forward, eyes straight ahead. I figured stopping would leave me vulnerable, and for some odd reason no one else was out on my side of the street walking in my direction, probably because of this creep. I upped my pace as much as possible, my heart pumping furiously from the increased activity and the knowledge that someone was behind me. But as I had been going to an interview, I had opted for heels that day. I didn't want to risk tripping. My uninvited company kept up without a problem and began to share with me in explicit detail what he'd like to do with women with nice booties. It was nothing I was particularly interested in doing with him, regardless of what he looked like. I still didn't know. At this point, we were passing my apartment buildings with gated entrances. I was hoping someone would emerge and help me out, but I had no luck. I was too nervous to turn down a side street, not knowing if there would be an area that would be perfect for this not-so-gentleman to do exactly what he was describing to me. For what seemed like eternity, this man with a gruff voice followed me and didn't stop talking. At one point, he described the differences in the niceness of booties by ethnicity and began trying to guess mine, based solely on the appearance of my rear and hair color, I guess. Finally, as I was approaching the street I needed to turn on, I noticed the thrift shop coming up was open. Not only was it open, but the door that's normally closed that faces the street I was on was open. Double doors propped open by chairs with a large sign over the entrance announcing some groundbreaking sale. I still had no clue if my follower had a weapon. He hadn't touched me with an object or any part of his person yet, so I decided to keep my pace. But when we reached the thrift store, I made a sharp left and sprinted into the shop about halfway through. I turned when I was on the other side of the pay counter, which was a combination jewelry display and cashier setup right in the center of the store. There was a man standing at the door, staring into the store. He wasn't looking at me. It kind of seemed like he was looking into space. He had long dark gray hair and an unkempt beard that was mostly black. His skin was dark, but more like it had been exposed to the sun rather than naturally dark. He reminded me of Brock's dad from Pokemon when Ash first runs into him outside of Pewter City, in a green coat a few sizes too big and faded jeans. The cashier turned to see what I was looking at. She yelled, "Hey, get out of here!" Her words seemed to shake him out of his trance, and he took off the way he had come. She asked me if I wanted to look at anything in the jewelry cases. I shook my head no, still a little winded from the experience to talk. I walked over to a sofa and sat down. I pulled out my phone and called my then boyfriend, now husband. He came to collect me and took me home. He ended up staying the night to calm my nerves. It ended up being a nice night filled with Netflix, takeout, and snuggles. But I walked a lot less after that and moved out of the area shortly thereafter. When I was young, from the ages of 2 to 10, I lived on a 7-acre ranch. There was a small house in front of the property where we lived, a huge grass yard and cabinet shop behind it, and an orchard in the very back full of walnut trees. My father was a carpenter that always worked in the shop, and my mother was a school teacher that was almost always busy. Because of their jobs and the fact that they were new to parenting, as I got older, they really didn't pay as much attention as they should to where I would wander off. I would spend my days roaming around the yard, playing in the dirt and running through the walnut trees. I obviously didn't question my lack of supervision, as it was fun to explore this huge plot of land, and I just thought I was being a normal kid. When I was about 7 years old, my father surprised me with a brand new child-sized ATV. It wasn't one of the electric ones that you are probably picturing either. It was a fast, gas-powered quad four-wheeler. Now at this point, a good amount of you are probably questioning why someone would give a gas-powered ATV to a 7-year-old child, but like I said, my parents were a bit reckless and my dad, just wanted me to have fun. Pretty much right after I got the thing, I learned how to ride it by myself, and started going further into and past the property than I ever had before. I now had a free ride basically as far as my young self would let me go before turning back. I started riding through the orchards behind my house almost every day, and I loved it more than I had loved anything before. I would leave my house and be gone for hours. After a while, I gradually started roaming farther and farther away from my house as I became more brazen and a little older. I would ride down this dirt path that leads past what I assumed was our neighbor's land into a ditch that held water. At the time, I just liked looking at the water as it flowed, and I felt like I was a little explorer. I honestly never contemplated that what I was doing could be the least bit dangerous, and I really don't think my parents knew how far I was riding. When I think back on it now, just the idea of riding a pretty dangerous piece of equipment far away from my house without my parents knowing where I was, and before cell phones existed, is pretty scary in itself, as I could have crashed or hit my head, and no one would have been able to find me. However, luckily this never happened, and it is not what the story is about. So one day, like every other day, I was riding far away from home, and I passed by a man wearing a dirty white shirt, denim jeans, and a wicker farmer's hat. I remember it vividly, as it was the first person I had seen in all the time I had been out there. I remember the surprised look in his eyes as he stared at me a while as I passed by him. I had no reason to stop, and my parents had always taught me about stranger danger, so I kept going and forgot about it. On the way back home, a couple hours later, I was coming up to the same spot, and it dawned on me that this is where I had seen the man. I looked ahead, not expecting him to be there, as I said it had been hours, yet as the trees parted, there he was. I really didn't think it was too weird because I figured that he was either a farmer or a homebody, so I kept driving, coming closer to where he was. He seemed friendly, to be honest. He had a big smile on his face like he was happy to see me. To my 10-year-old self, I just thought he was a friendly guy, so I waved at him as I passed by and he waved back. I continued on my way and drove home, not thinking much about it. I don't really remember how much time had passed between then and the next time I went riding, but it couldn't have been more than a couple of days. Like usual, I took the same dirt road past the same few orchards to the same ditch full of water. I didn't think much about my previous encounter, so I hadn't been thinking about the stranger with the big smile. I was sitting on the edge of the ditch when I heard footsteps in the dirt coming from behind me. Again, I remember this vividly because it was not a common occurrence to see anyone on this trail. I remember being more curious than scared and turned around to see the same stranger with the smile. This time his smile seemed to be more of a toothy grin. He called out to me as he walked up to me, asking what my name was in a heavy southern drawl. I told him with confidence that I wasn't really allowed to talk to strangers, to which he said, "It's a good idea, although you really shouldn't be out here all by yourself. It can be dangerous for a kid your age." I remember this striking me in the gut with a little bit of a butterfly feeling. I wasn't afraid, but I felt uneasy. This piqued my curiosity, however, as I wondered what he meant, so I asked him. He continued to walk closer to me slowly and answered, "I heard they found a little boy out here just around your age. I think it was that ditch right there where he drowned." I would like to point out here that although my parents were reckless, they weren't stupid. If there had been a drowning near a house that was reported, or there had been a story in the paper, they definitely wouldn't have let me out anymore. Anyways, he continued, "Why don't you come with me and I'll take you back to your parents? It's not safe out here for a kid your age." It's okay. I have my quad right here. I'll just ride back." I pointed over to the side of him where my quad was, but he didn't look. His eyes remained fixed on me. They were deep brown, almost black, and piercing into me. At this point I was scared, and I knew that this could be a bad situation. I was hoping that he was just a concerned old man, but there was no way I was going with him anywhere. I got to my feet to start walking to my quad, to which the man said, "Should a kid your age be riding something that dangerous? Let's just put it in my truck and I'll give you a ride back." "I don't see a truck," I said, looking around, hoping to talk my way out of the situation. "Oh, it's right over there on my property. You can't see it from here?" he said, his smile widening. "It's really okay. I'll just go now," I said, starting again to walk to my quad. But as I passed him, he reached and grabbed my arm. "You really shouldn't be out here," he said, staring me deep in the eyes. "It's not safe for little kids." "Let me go, you're hurting me," I shouted, starting to panic, but this only made him grip tighter. "Maybe you don't deserve to go back home. What kind of parents would let their kid out here all alone? Maybe you should come home with me, and I'll take care of you." At this point, I was about to pee my pants. I was freaking out, and I started to scream. I don't know if I was saying anything. I just know I was screaming as loud as I ever had before. This only seemed to anger him, as his once toothy grin turned to a face of anger. He put his hand over my face, and I took this opportunity to bite his finger as hard as I could. I still remember the taste of blood, so I know I hurt him pretty bad. Thankfully, this caught him off guard as he finally let me go. I knew this was my one chance to get away from this weirdo, so I booked it to my quad as he winced in pain. "You little heathen, get over here," he cried in anger. I knew I didn't have much time, so I jumped on my quad and turned the key as fast as I could. I started up, and just as I pulled the gas handle, I felt a hand start to grab my neck. Luckily, he didn't have a grip yet, as I already started to drive away. I punched it out of there. At this point, all I could hear was the sound of my quad, so I wasn't sure if he was running after me, but I wasn't going to look, as I could probably crash and be out of luck. I drove down the dirt path as fast as the quad would go, probably the fastest I had ever driven. When I got home, I peeled out into the dirt and ran into the house, hoping to God my mom was home. I burst into her room bawling, and there she was. She asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't talk yet as I was so afraid. I just kept bawling. I think I was crying for a good 30 minutes before I could summon up the strength to stop and tell her what had happened. I remember the fear in her eyes as I described what happened. She pulled me close to her and hugged me as hard as she ever had. The next day I talked to a police officer and recounted the story of what transpired. I honestly don't remember much after this, as I started to block it out. It's not really something a 10-year-old wants to think about. Needless to say, they never let me off the property again. My dad started drinking and we lost the house soon after this anyways, so I didn't really have to live there much longer. Recently, I was thinking about that day after I started trying to remember various parts of my childhood. My parents had never told me about what happened after the cops were called, and I never really asked because I tried not to think about it. Yesterday, I went to her house and asked her if they ever found the guy, considering he had lived pretty close to our property. She was kind of startled by the question because we hadn't talked about this in 15 years. She paused for a minute as if pondering whether to tell me, and said, "We didn't have any neighbors out that way. It was all corporate-owned land, and the description you gave didn't match any of the neighbors in the other direction. We called the cops, and they went to search where you told us you were, but the guy was long gone by the time they got there. They looked around the property and found an abandoned house that hadn't been used in years since the land was purchased. When they looked inside, they could tell that he had been staying there. Apparently, he left his stuff behind. We never told you this because you were way too young, but one of the things they found was a black grocery bag. It had a roll of duct tape and a hunting knife inside." I was recently reminded of something that happened to me when I was 8. My family had moved out to a small farm in the country, and I was going to a very small area school which had a rickety little bus that did a wide circuit, dropping off kids nearish to where they lived. Actually quite a distance, but nearish in country terms, I guess. I was walking home from where it dropped me off. No one else around, shingle road with only paddocks, fields on either side, no houses in sight, when a car came down the road and stopped by me. The man in it wound the window down and called to me. I was a bit wary but stopped since he was talking to me. He asked if I knew where any dairy farms were. Now, having just moved to the country, I didn't know exactly what a dairy farm was, and in New Zealand we call corner convenience stores dairies in the cities, so I was picturing some sort of farm with a little shop, which seemed a bit odd to me, but I said I didn't know about any. Then he suggested I get in and I could help him look for one, leaning over and opening the passenger side door. Fortunately, I was close to our farm, so I said I had to go, then dashed through the nearest fence and went diagonally across the fields towards home, which, while I thought that was a bit sketchy at the time, looking back now, there's no way a man would ask some random little kid to get in their car to help them look for a dairy farm, not even a specific farm, and holy crap, what a narrow escape. Thank cripes I didn't know what a dairy farm was. I don't think there was any around that way, either. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.